Right then, first things first, we need a working tempo. And in most cases with this form of uplifting trance, we're going to have 138 BPM. So I'm going to set that at 138 here. Of course, there's always going to be exceptions to any rule, and in this case, they may run from 134 to 136 to 138 to 140. Make your choice and stick with it. Now, I think the best way to start writing this style of music is by getting the chords down first. Now, I say this because you can spend a couple of hours writing this banging drum loop, but if you can't nail the musical elements of the genre, you're not really going to have a track. So the first thing we need to do here is decide on a key for our track. I don't think I've mentioned this yet, but I'm going to be writing this track from scratch. I've got no idea what it's going to turn out like, but I think by working this way, you kind of get a better idea of what's involved than you have to strip back a track I've already made. I think you miss a lot of the creativity in that. So for this track, I'm thinking of composing in, say, F minor. It's a popular trance key, and it consists of the notes F, G, A flat, B flat, C, D flat. Actually, I'll tell you what, we'll write in A minor instead. The reason I'm saying A minor is because it consists of the notes A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. It couldn't be simpler, and I think it might make things a bit easier to follow along when I start playing around with a bit of music theory here. So, the first thing I like to do is I like to start my trance tracks with a piano sample in the EXS-24 here. Now, you can use pretty much any instrument for this, a Nexus piano, a Contact piano, whatever, but I do recommend using some kind of piano because at such an early stage in production, it's easy to get stuck up your own ass with synthesis, and the idea here is just to get the musical ideas down and working first. So the first thing we've got to do is get our chords down, as I've said. So how do we do that? Well, there's a few ways. First of all, we could use... I've got X for Records Cthulhu here. If I turn the ARP off, so we've just got our chords here. We can go on our chord presets, and this I've got Icon Diatonic, which gives me the A minor there. I should actually mention that the standard edition of Cthulhu doesn't include this diatonic option. I actually grabbed this from the internet. I can't remember where, but I'm positive anti-Google will know. But anyway, with this setup, I can hit just a single note on my controller keyboard, and it's going to respond with a chord based off that root note. You see I've hit B there, and this is the chord it's given. Hit C, that's the chord. So I can sit here and keep pressing notes one after the other until I come up with a chord progression I like the sound of. It's a pretty easy way of working it. It can be great for coming up with chord ideas for your music. Now, if you don't have Cthulhu, there's another option. This is, I'll just call it up here. This is Odyssey by Mixed in Key, and this actually has a database of chords. So what we do is we change this to A minor, like that, and then we just click add a chord progression. And there's our chord progression. You can go through here and you can choose different chord progressions. Again, it's another viable option if you're afraid of writing your own chords or aren't too well up on a lot of chord theory, but to be honest, producing your own chords for trance really isn't too hard. So I'm going to show you a way that you can do it very quick and easy if you don't want to use Odyssey or Cthulhu here. I'll actually take that off as well. So the first thing I want to do is start this bar. Now, a typical trance melody is going to run over 8 bars of music, and a lot of artists will typically subdivide these 8 bars here into groups of 2. So that will be 4 chords, each 2 bars long. So we'd have a chord there, a chord there, a chord there, and a chord there. I'll just actually call up the pencil tool, call up our piano editor there so we can see what we're doing. Now, at this point, the best approach, I think, is not to actually worry about producing a chord All we really want to be interested in is getting the root note of each chord down, because the actual chords can come later. So I'm just going to bring this down so we see the entire length there. I'm going to start my chord on the first note of the scale, as in the root note. So I'm going to go for A there. Obviously, I just want to pull that out to go over 2 bars like that. Now, you don't have to do this. The root note of your first chord doesn't have to be the first note of your scale. You could start on the 4th, the 5th, or the 6th note of the scale if you wanted to. So there's our first note there. Where do we go next? Well, the next important note would actually be the final note over here, because the relationship between this final note moving back to the first note is going to dictate a majority of the feel and the energy of your music, because it's the musical resolve. Now, the resolve is important because our enjoyment of music comes from the tension and the release that it provides. The first few chords here kind of build up a tension, and then that tension is released by resolving back around to our note here. Now, I've spent a few months listening almost constantly to uplifting trance in preparation for this tutorial, and I can say that in the vast majority of the tracks I've listened to, they've all employed one of 5 different types of resolves, and these were the 4th note revolving back to the 1st, the 5th note revolving back to the 1st, the 5th note revolving back to the 6th. Now, obviously, that would mean that your first note here would be the 6th note in your scale, which in my case would be the F there. Then we had the 6th note revolving back to the 4th, which obviously your first note here would be the 4th in the scale, which in my example would be D. Or it was the first note resolving back to the 5th here. So that obviously that means your first note here would be the 5th, and in my key that would be the E. Now, since I'm starting my chord progression with the first note of the scale here, which is the A, the best option for me will be to use the 4th or 5th note resolving back to the 1st. Now, in A minor, the 5th note will be E, so my final note here will go up to the E there. And I'm actually going to copy that to there. I'm going to copy the A to there. Now I'm going to play this back, and what I want you to listen to is the way that this note resolves back to this note. So that's why I've copied them there and there, so you can have a listen how each one resolves back. I hope you can hear it there, how it sounds right, it feels right, it's a comfortable, familiar move. Now, I must stress here that you don't have to follow any of these recommendations because, well, they're just that, they're just recommendations. I'm just suggesting them so you could use them to become comfortable with producing this music, and then as you get more and more comfortable with producing this form of music, you could change it. For example, if you want to try something different, you could change the resolve here to the 3rd note going to the 1st. And if you have listened to the result of this, as you can hear, it still works, but it sounds less familiar and I suppose a bit edgier, a bit more serious perhaps. The real trick is to experiment with moving the final note here above or below the first note. And if you like how it sounds, just go with it. There is no right and wrong here. But as I'm writing a classic kind of example track that's going to be featured in the intro video, I really want a classic kind of trance track. So I'm going to move to the E back to the A, which is a 5th to the 1st resolve there. So I can move those two back to the centre now. So I've got my first note and I've got my final note. So I just need to fill in these 2 gaps here. And this is only 2 notes, as you can see, so it's not exactly rocket science. The only real caveat is that if you want your progression to sound interesting, it's best to employ a mix of leaps and steps. Now, in music, a step is a note that moves directly from one note to the next note in the scale. For example, in A minor that I'm working in here, a stepwise motion will be moving from A to B or B to C. Now, the thing is, if we employ steps throughout a chord progression, it's going to sound predictable and a bit cliche. So if I, for example, want A, B, C, D, and I played that back, well, it sounds a bit meh. So let's introduce a leap into this. I'm just going to move that back up there. So we have got a mini leap there, actually. And if you haven't already figured this out, a leap is when we move more than one note up or down the scale. We actually leap over a series of notes. So if I was to take this note, for example, and move it up to, I don't know, F. We'll move it up to F. We've suddenly got that leap from A to F. So have a listen to how that sounds. It already sounds better. Now, as well as leaping upwards, we could equally leap downwards as well. Now, the thing to note here is that in our sequence here, we now only have leaps. We start on A, then we're leaping to the F, then we leap to the C, and then we leap to the A. And that resolves again by leaping back down to the A there. We have no steps in here. Now, there are no rules to say that we must have steps, but generally a mix of leaps and steps makes the music sound a little less disjointed. So I want to bring in a stepwise motion, and I could do this on any of these two middle notes here. I could take this note, for example, and push it up to there. Then we've got a step there. So we have A leaping down to the F, which leaps up to the C, then that steps up to our E there, and then the E leaps down to our A. So let's have a quick listen to that. And that's it. That's the basis for a trance chord. It's really not that complicated at all. If you start to build like this and build it up, it's actually pretty simple. I mean, there I've got the simple progression of the first to the sixth, to the fourth, and then to the fifth. Well, there you go. I did that completely by accident, but it actually goes to prove a point I was going to mention next. And that's, if you're new to production and you just want to end this tutorial with a finished track without copying me, try starting your track with one of the 5 classic chord progressions. And these are the first to the fifth to the sixth to the fourth. Now, that's sometimes known as the optimistic progression. For trance, this can generate kind of a very uplifting feel in the music. Then we've got the sixth to the fourth to the first to the fifth. Now, sometimes they call this the pessimistic progression, or if you write a lot of pop music or you've worked with pop music, you'll probably know it as the sensitive female chord progression. And then we have fifth to the sixth to the fourth to the first, then the fourth to the first to the fifth to the sixth. And then we've got my progression here, which was the first to the sixth to the fourth to the fifth there, which I've got to admit was completely accidental, but it does go to show that employing a mix of steps and leaps will tend to lead you towards these classic progressions. Now, these are the most commonly employed progressions in music. I don't want to trivialize music, but if you're new to this, or you just want to write something that's going to connect very quickly with your listening audience, you'll tend to use one of these 5 progressions. Each is going to strike this immediate chord with your listener, and no pun intended there. I didn't mean that one. But feel free to send me hate mail about it, while you sit there thinking you can come up with a completely original chord progression. I do like a good laugh in my inbox, but Above all, I suppose, don't feel you have to use these that I've mentioned. You play around, experiment. The important thing is, if it sounds right, it is right. You've grown up listening to music, so you instinctively know if what you're doing is right. I think the most important thing I say is just don't overthink it. I think this is the biggest problem with a lot of producers, from my experience. They tend to overthink and then panic and then procrastinate because they feel they may fail at producing a track at the end of it. Just keep it simple, like I have done here, and if it feels good, then it is. So with these basic notes down, we can now build them up in some chords.